First of all, an apology. I was unable to come until yesterday, so I missed the first day of activities. Sadly missed the first day of activities. I've heard they were wonderful, and I thought they would be, so I'm especially eager to acknowledge the fact that I was unable to join you. I have taken the liberty of writing a very big paper, which I will not read all of, simply because there is no time. So I'm going to try to get done in about 30 minutes. But I've been thinking for a long time about the current conjuncture of the humanities and sort of the relation between the humanities and the crisis of the university. I think about that crisis broadly under the heading of the University of Austerity. And so I'm trying here to develop a way of thinking about the humanities. And in this particular iteration, I explore what it might mean to think about something I call the sinister humanities. Now, to justify using that rather provocative expression, I turn quickly to thinking about sinister in its kind of more Latin derivation of the left hand. And I get there in the course of the paper, that portion of it which I will not read, first by thinking about what Engels is trying to tell us in his little fragment on the transition of the ape to the human, or literally the becoming human of the ape, and the role that labor plays in that. Quickly, labor becomes the hand. And there's a very important formulation there, a very technogenetical formulation of thinking about the hand as both the means by which things are made, but through that making, how the hand itself becomes made. And it becomes, in a sense, a product of producing value. It's that producing value part that I'm trying to pull over into thinking about the contemporary situation of the humanities. From the Engels, I go to Derrida in the Geschlecht essays, specifically the one on Heidegger's hand. I'm interested in the sort of two pieces of his criticism, one having to do with the way that Heidegger builds a relationship between Dasein and the hand, and does it quite pointedly in order to separate the hand from the ape, to separate the hand from the animal, as it were. Derrida, as you can imagine, is immediately interested in that gesture. The other thing that I'm interested in there is Derrida's insistence on the fact that Heidegger speaks generally, with rare and therefore interesting exceptions, about the hand, not the hands. So the kind of suppression of the bilateral symmetry, to use an expression that one would find in Le Roi Gourand. And that aspect of it I'm interested in because what I sense is that Derrida himself doesn't really respond to the bilateral asymmetry of favoring the right hand over the left. And it's that part that I'm going to pick up on and go from there. So, in 1909, shortly before his death, the French sociologist Robert Hertz published The Preeminence of the Right Hand, a study in religious polarity. As its title makes plain, Hertz was preoccupied with dexterism, that is, the broadly sociocultural favoring of right-handedness. Although Hertz adduces the paleontological insight that animals similar to the genus Homo are typically ambidextrous, he is more immediately concerned to establish both that right-handedness is imposed from outside the human organism and that the reason for this has to do with his titular theme of religious polarity. A polarity, he reads, is articulated in the flesh of bilateralism as such. He wonders provocatively, given this, why isn't the presumed weaker hand, the word left derives from the Anglo-Saxon lift, for weak, why isn't the weaker hand subjected to an orthopedic correction or development? Why, in other words, is a polarity deemed natural and universal aggressively supplemented through specific cultural practices? Although such questions might lead one to rethink the very origins of religion, Hertz is content to observe that the left hand is not strengthened because it is feared, and it is feared because within the discourse of religious polarity it is grasped as sinister. In spelling out the discourse of religious polarity, Hertz appeals to three important concepts: the other, the division of labor, and circumcision. Generally, the religious polarity that matters to him is one made familiar to us long ago through Mary Douglas's work that traces the distinction between the sacred and the profane, the pure and the impure, through various manifestations of cultural values. Although his impulse towards totalization, this idea of this distinction being universal, although his impulse towards totalization is one we have grown suspicious of, he inflects this in relation to various important domains of human activity and comes upon the problem of the other by thinking about the space of community. Drawing on Garrick Mallory's pioneering work in indigenous semiotics, he writes, quote, "It is well known that many primitive peoples," that's his expression, "particularly Indians of North America, can converse without saying a word, simply by movements of the head and arms. In this language, each hand acts in accord with its nature. The right hand stands for me. The left hand stands for not me, others." The gesturing traced here is prefigured in his description of the circle of community, a circle bisected by an inside, that is, the right side, and an outside, the left side. What this clarifies is that religious polarity seizes the communal event of language at the level of the enunciative distribution of shifters, me, you, I, they, etc. However subtle the interaction of polarity, language, and corporal homology, Hertz's argument against cerebralism holds, and holds necessarily, that the asymmetry that concerns him comes from where the left hand points, that is, from the outside. Repeatedly, Hertz describes the encounter between the organism and the outside as a mutilation, but a mutilation of a very unique sort. And it's in this context that he develops this idea of the treatment of the left hand resembling circumcision. I'll not read all the way through that. In ways that invite more attention than can be given here, Hertz brings bilateral asymmetry into generative contact with the class structure, and thus the more typically political connotations of the left. In establishing how religious polarities give structure to social practices as diverse as etiquette, warfare, and instruction and weaving, Hertz traces how the preeminence of the right hand manifests in each. He explains this in the following quote. "Naturally, only the right hand comes into contact with the sacred, and in this particular example, the sacred post, the profanation of which would be fatal to an initiate, someone being taught to weave. And it is the same hand that carries the thread, which is also sacred, from left to right. As for the profane hand, the left, it can cooperate only humbly and at a distance in the solemn work that is done. Doubtless, this division of labor is relaxed in the case of rougher and more profane pursuits. But nonetheless, it remains the case that as a rule, techniques consist in setting in motion, by delicate manipulation, dangerous mystical forces. Only the sacred and effective hand can take the risk of initiation. If the baneful hand actively intervenes, it will only dry up the source of its success and vitiate the work that is undertaken." A student of Durkheim, Hertz here makes use of his mentor's category of the division of labor in a novel and pointed way. Whereas for Durkheim, the division of labor served largely as a means by which to gauge the specificity of the industrial as opposed to the artisanal mode of production, and in particular the forms of solidarity made possible in the wake of the eclipse of its organic form, Hertz invokes this category as a way to think the hierarchical structure of the field of religious polarity as it grips the bilateral organization of the human body. This feels less like a figurative extension of the category and more like a novel insight into how labor and the body come to bear on one another. That said, Hertz's formulation invites one to hear within it an evocation of the labor theory of value as well. Of particular poignancy for the line of reflection I'm pursuing is the way Hertz draws on the hand as the means by which to hold together the notion of value as derived from the corporeal expenditure of labor power, that portion of the sugar loaf Marx famously insisted you cannot weigh, and subjectivation. Put differently, Hertz's discussion of bilateral asymmetry manages to fuse, however tentatively, the mutilations that sustain it to the division of labor whose forms of solidarity produce the humans they otherwise merely appear to distribute within a network of dependencies. Here, I will argue, we glimpse the reworking of the value of work that might matter to a sinister humanities. In light of what I've said, I suspect I will now be expected to attach the hand, indeed the left hand, to the body of the international working class in order to insist on the decisive, if counterintuitive, solidarity of humanists of a certain stripe and proletarians. As with most such expectations, it's only partly wrong. What strikes me as particularly wrong about this expectation, however, is the way it succumbs immediately to a reactive defense of the humanities, and does so in a dexterous gesture of ferreting out allies in the battle against the neoliberalization of knowledge and the onset of the university of austerity. Instead, let us entertain what might be gained by going on the offensive. In the time remaining, I will offend by reading a few humanistically inflected articulations of sinisterism. Derrida's impossible Glas, and two piano concertos, one by Maurice Ravel and the other by Sergei Prokofiev, both commissioned by Ludwig Wittgenstein's brother Paul in the wake of his loss of his right arm during the First World War. Both are referred to as piano concertos for the left hand. Although I will take these objects up in seriatim, their engagement with the articulation of bilateral asymmetry, in effect the gesture of two uneven hands playing, will in the end complicate this expository impulse. And to be clear, my point here is pedagogical. What can these texts teach us about a left-leaning humanities? As readers of Derrida know, Glas is not the first of his texts whose typographic layout has recourse to the device of two columns. One finds this already in Tympan, the opening salvo in Margins. And if one sets living on borderlines along its side, the two ribbons that comprise the text might also bear resemblance to columns. But with Glas, a text titled by a sound, the bicolumnar structure is sustained and refined. In the early commentaries on this text, and I am thinking here of the exemplary status of Gayatri Spivak's Compte Rendu in Diacritics, a certain implicit organological perspective prevails. The columns are read as legs, and in Spivak's reading, the legs spread of a presumably heterosexual woman. Indeed, at a certain point in her analysis, even dimorphic phalluses, which Spivak, putting special emphasis on the fold or invaginal crease between them, wants to, in a certain way, both point to and complicate. While sensible, given the typographic placement of Hegel, the spread Egel, on the left, I want to rather stress that they're dealing here not with legs, but with hands, the left hand and right hand column of the text. And I ask the question very simply, what's going on here? Very recently, Geoffrey Nealon has been thinking about the columns of Glas as languages. On the left, the language of animals. On the right, the language of plants or flowers. A gambit, one assumes, inspired by the distinction between flower and animal religions made early in the text, and this despite the persistent entwinement of flowers and animals in both columns or hands. While reserving judgment on the merits of this reading protocol, it does seem important to underscore the way the presentation of Hegel, in addition to tracing the interpenetration of Western philosophy and the family romance of heterosexual kinship structure, is also a meditation on the problem of the human and the non-human animal, a problem that Derrida was to elaborate in considerable detail some 40 years later. Put differently, the Hegel-Eagle matrix is not merely philological. What is made explicit in the text when Derrida, tracking the surprising articulation between narcissism and dialectical reason, pauses over Hegel's discussion of sexual reproduction. Commenting on Hegel in the Encyclopedia, Derrida writes, and I'll read it in English, "In the animal kingdom, generation, the sex relationship, the process of copulation, that, like a syllogism's copula, gathers together the genus with itself, they all engulf individuals in death straight out. Unlike the human rational family, animal copulation does not give rise to any higher determination. Animal copulation leaves behind it no monument, no burial place, no institution, no law that opens and assures any history. It names nothing." End quote. What this prepares is an argument that shows how the conflict between the individual and the institution that grounds Hegelian rationality, and perhaps even the reason of philosophy as such, not only founds the essence of reason in and on this conflict, but does so by depriving in principle the non-human animal of its piquant frustrations. Thus, already here, the deconstruction of Western philosophy is consummated in the figure of Hegel, takes the form of teasing out a certain limit of the human, and not merely the human as a concept. Aware that separating oneself from Hegel is vexed business, Derrida not only puts Hegel under the broad heading of heteronormative kinship structures, an argument made even more emphatically in the Politics of Friendship, but he draws fixed attention to the fate of the non-human animal in this arrangement. Moreover, he puts all of this over to the left. It deserves emphasis, I should think, that according to Benoit Peters, Derrida struggled mightily with his publishers, first Fata Morgana and then Éditions Galilée, to have the text, a text painstakingly typed out on a mechanical typewriter, laid out in precisely the way that we now find it. Thus, the point about the human as an animal, confounding limits to Hegelian reason, falls with a certain deliberate calculation on the left of the text. But now what of the hand as such? Now what I do here is I go through a kind of careful tracing of how he actually is referring to the left column as the place of the hand, and he does it by pointing to the fact that he's got many pieces of Hegel's notes in which he's insisting on the handwritten character of the materials. And what I'm trying to show there is that there seems then to be an effort to line up animal left hand critique of philosophy in this particular text. But now what is to be learned from the sound of one hand playing? In fact, a left hand playing in the place of the missing right hand. Is this even a left hand? In Kant's essay concerning the ultimate ground of the differentiation of directions in space, the irreducible homology of the hands establishes space as the abstract context within which all objects are distributed in their locations. Thus, in the absence of a left hand, is there orientation or even space? These are massive questions. To maneuver around such imponderables, I want to approach them through a decision, actually two decisions. First, a decision made by Paul Wittgenstein in the wake of the amputation of his right arm to commission piano concertos written for a left-handed pianist. But a second decision to never perform one of the commissioned pieces, Sergei Prokofiev's Concerto for Piano and Orchestra No. 4 in B-flat major. As he, that is to say, as Paul Wittgenstein, wrote to Prokofiev upon receipt of the score, quote, "I don't understand a single note of it and I shall not play it," and he paid $5,000 at the time for the piece. The sinister wisdom at work in this decision, such as it is, I think is easier to discern when Prokofiev's piece is compared to Ravel's Concerto for Piano and Orchestra in D major, a piece Wittgenstein himself premiered in Vienna in the winter of 1932, and one deliberately crafted so as not to resemble the piece that Prokofiev himself was generating. A proper engagement with this material would obviously require listening to the music, but they're 15 minutes apiece, so we're not going to do that. I did bring the CD. If you'd like to borrow it from me, I'm happy to give it to you. But here's an account. Ravel's concerto dates from that period in his work that Adorno has described as succumbing to the masquerade. By this he means that Ravel subordinates structural logic to the necessities of ornament. Musical effects call forth and determine their causes. That said, the concerto is tightly structured around 4 movements: a lento, an andante, allegro, and tempo 1. The lento movement starts out in the same thematic territory as Beethoven's 9th Symphony, a roiling surge of notes in search of the chromatic palette of D major. In fairly standard concerto fashion, the first movement builds to the entry of the piano, which no sooner enters than it too falls back into the harmonic terrain of the opening royal. Indeed, the piano often repeats the gesture of striving upward and falling back. However, by the concluding flourish of the final movement, piano and orchestra are, as it were, on the same page, and the piece ends with a series of strident chords that, in marking out the logic of tonality in a major key, bookend the concerto by embodying the order that the royal was sort of grasping for and failing to find. I know of no extant recording of Wittgenstein's performance of the piece, but of the ones he commissioned, only this one and the one by Benjamin Britten have found their way into the concert repertory. There are myriad tangled reasons for this, but let me suggest that what Ravel in particular offered is effectively a narrative of loss and recovery. His piece might be said to be prosthetic in that it allows us to hear the disorder of a body deprived of bilateral asymmetry, followed by its supplementation and the compensatory restoration of asymmetry in and by the left hand. As with the troubled notion of ambidexterity, meaning literally having 2 right hands, Ravel's Masque presents us with a score in which a certain ambisinisterity becomes audible. It speaks to the sort of plasticity that Catherine Malabou has set opposite the scar, and is for that reason affirming and affirmative. The left does not gesture to another. Instead, it points back to the one that is missing. We know from his correspondence that Prokofiev received word of Wittgenstein's commission while living in France and sketched out the concerto during the summer of 1931. In fact, not long after accepting the commission, Prokofiev met Wittgenstein in Paris so the latter might demonstrate his special technique for playing the entire keyboard with the hand typically positioned to the left of middle C. He had a swivel chair. As this might imply, the men were on friendly terms, a fact that sheds light on the following exchange. Upon learning of Wittgenstein's refusal to perform the piece, Prokofiev wrote saying, quote, "You must understand how a composer suffers when a work has been buried since its birth. Although this piece didn't have the opportunity of pleasing you, I am persuaded it has legitimate musical value." To which Wittgenstein responded, quote, "Your concerto," and here's his concession, "or at least a considerable part of it, is not understood by me. I insist on this word. There is an enormous difference between a poem I don't like and a poem the sense of which I do not understand." He goes on in response to Prokofiev's announced intent to rewrite the piece for 2 hands, to insist that the commissioned piece be acknowledged as the source of the adaptation. In approaching the piece somewhat more musicologically, I want nevertheless to stress that although Wittgenstein softens his criticism, he makes a point of stressing the hermeneutic problem of understanding, carefully setting it apart from an aesthetic judgment of taste. He's not saying that he doesn't like it. Instead, as the example of the poem makes clear, he cannot and will not perform the piece because he doesn't understand its sense. At the risk of overstating, the evocation of poetry here is important in at least two ways. First, it places this whole exchange in the broad theoretical framework of the new musicology, where music is actually understood to make sense. And second, especially when contrasted with the Ravel concerto, the poem embodies a sense that may be elusive because it resists narrative form. This last is a speculative remark, to be sure, but it's one that helps us listen to Prokofiev's concerto in a productive way. Now again, it would bear listening to this, but I'm going to try to describe it. As with the Ravel piece that it is avoiding, Prokofiev's composition is also structured around four movements, vivace, andante, moderato, and a very short closing vivace. Unlike the lento movement that opens Ravel's concerto, where an amorphous roll crescendos to frame the piano's entry, Prokofiev's vivace opens immediately with the orchestra and the piano, articulating and developing the fundamental harmonic material. The voicing here, as well as elsewhere, is such that the piano and various bits of the orchestra are trading off melodic responsibilities. In fact, one of the truly remarkable things about Prokofiev's concerto is the fact that there is virtually no soloing on the part of the piano. Again, in the correspondence, one sees that Prokofiev was obliged at a certain point to reassure Wittgenstein that there would indeed be solo passages for the piano. But even, for example, the solo piano that opens the closing vivace, it does so only to kind of set up and usher the listener to the final orchestral flourish. To draw what I will call the sinister lesson of Wittgenstein's reaction to this piece, one must note that at one level, the sense that escapes him might bear on the very conventions of the concerto. What Prokofiev achieves here is the unbearable fusion of convention and its suspension. Here is a piano concerto in which any or every instrument is acting like the piano. This is a bit of an overstatement, but hyperbole has its values, and here it reminds us of the narrative function of soloing. What Prokofiev is complicating is precisely that narrative impulse in Ravel to stage the prosthetic triumph of the one-handed pianist. Instead, we get many variations on an absence, the absence of the right hand, as it sounds in and as a piano concerto. Even some of the fingering stretches for the piano chords between treble and bass clef seem motivated by the drive to note and then resist filling a certain span. What we are given to hear is not the affirmation and restoration of the torn musician made whole through a commissioned and compensatory repertoire. And as a consequence, the left hand does not, indeed cannot, point at or toward the right. It points toward another, to the missing bilateral asymmetry that marks the place of the human animal in musical sound. Let me suggest then that this is what Wittgenstein doesn't understand about the piece. This is why, even though he can play it, technically, he can't and he won't. The grasp that eludes him is a sinister one. By way of conclusion, it seems important here to put what I've been saying in dialogue with what in North America is called disability studies, a political and theoretical initiative that has fundamentally complicated the presumed able-bodiedness of the subject under scrutiny in both the humanities and the social sciences. This has been nowhere more pertinent than in sound studies, giving special urgency, I should think, to Seth Kim Cohen's concept of non-cochlear listening. What I share with this initiative is the conviction that the mind-body dualism active within many variants of humanism affects both the concept and the critique of the human. Donna Haraway's meditation on the prosthesis of the service dog is an especially rich iteration of this point. However, as Hertz's work makes clear, what is essential about sinisterism is both its socio-political character, the tacit calculation of its maintenance, and its technogenetical testimony. It bespeaks the flesh of a constitutive disability. It has nothing to do with falling, but with leaning, with tendency as it is inscribed in the human, the speaking and laboring being. If we are prepared to follow Richard Sennett in his insistence that finding problems constitutes the distinctive work of the humanities, then perhaps the value it produces is a grasp of the human that reaches beyond the lament of dehumanization to take hold of the problem that is the human. The new materialist fascination with the object, with the universe without us, can be seen as leaning in certain ways in this direction. But it is not clear to me that this tendency is left-leaning. It often undervalues the fact that Marx was among the very first to think the mystery of an object he called the commodity, a technogenetical phenomenon if there ever was one. What I am stressing is that the social relations hieroglyphically inscribed in the commodity are not accidentally marked by the fact that so many of these commodities are made for right-handed users. Thus, to end without concluding, the task of the sinister humanist is not to clamor for left-handed eye watches. It is to point out that other things are more pressing, more worth our time. For example, the measure of human value itself. It ends there. Now, the part that I sort of suppressed there was my effort to take hold of the technogenetical insights that I took mainly out of Bernard's work, and in particular a little lecture that he gave called Des pieds et des mains, of feet and hands. And I was very interested in the way he was developing the kind of relation between the two, and especially the notion of the hand as gesturing upward and reaching. That I did not get the chance to read, and I think that sort of gives the impression that this is very tendentially in touch with what it is that we're discussing. But anyways, enough.